to have heard so many different definitions of European identity, because this very well shows how big problem we have. So even within the European Humanist Federation, we are unable to define European identity, and the real problem is probably what Niegos mentioned. I very much like this point that actually, even though we personally, all of us here probably would like to see Europe as the place where the values of the Enlightenment are shared, the truth is that at least half of our citizens don't share those values. That fascism is also a European value, that whichever value we will try to mention here, we will find a lot of people in Europe who totally despise or disregard those values. So even though we would like to build an identity which is not based on nation, it's not based on blood, it's not based on genetics, it's really so hard to find those values within the culture, within the civilization that we all share. And it's been so clear that you all referred to all kinds of common cultural background, but it was different. For me, when I was traveling outside of Europe and had a chance to have some kind of view on Europe from outside, a few impressions that I had when I tried to see, is there any difference between Europe and Europeans and the people from outside? There were basically things like, well, we probably don't eat that much rice, or the notion of a city, how a city is constructed, which is something common throughout the whole Europe. We have a certain idea that probably dates back to the Roman Empire, that there has to be certain structures, certain buildings for the public use, etc., certain institutions, certain facilities. So this is something very typical for Europe, which is not available everywhere else. But these are so practical, so pragmatic things. They definitely have nothing to do with identity. So if you add to it that we actually don't speak the same language, and it's so hard to learn all of these languages, or even to learn one of them, because we cannot decide which one it should be. So the real issue which we have in Europe is that we can not really find this common ground. So my question to you now is, what would be the humanist response? What kind of actions could we take to create this identity, to try to work on building the identity of the type that we feel that this identity should be? So the one based on, for example, the Enlightenment values. How can we convince other Europeans to share those values with us? And I suppose you would like to address also the whatever the other participants had said, but I will kindly ask you to limit yourself to 5 minutes each, because we are running out of time.
Before that, I know that our past president has to leave, so he wanted to make an intervention, I think.
Would you like to say something? Yes?
Yes,
please.
I know that he has to leave earlier.
It's true. Thank you very much. Thank you to give me this opportunity. Now, it's only to have another approach. As a whole many of Europe, what I think is that the first period that we live together was the reconstruction. All the European after the Second World War, together, they have one objective. It was how to rebuild a society in which we have welfare for everybody. That was an objective. And everybody take part to that. And when we enlarged European after the end of the war, for the new country, that was an objective too. It was to reconstruct a society like maybe a better kind of liberty. And after that, in the 70s, after the colonial period, I speak about the Western Europe. The Western Europe, they have as objective that we must be with a kind of capacity, a new capacity to be present in the world. No more with the colonial vision, but a new one. And we mobilized all the young people to go over the world. And we invite all this process of NGOs for cooperation, international cooperation. It was a vision again, and people take part to that. And now if you look to Europe today, it's the fortress Europe. And it's not only a fascist problem. All of the Europeans, they are ready to take part to this kind of fortress, to protect themselves. And they ask for protection, because they believe that they are in a new situation where they are uncertain, and where they are demobilized. And our task is to know how we can give a message, a project that Europe can take over for all of us, not only from the former old Europe, but for this large Europe. All Europeans can do that. Not only this one member of the Union, but all the Europeans can maybe have this kind of, and that's a good question that you put, no. So that for me, I believe that we must have this capacity to review what means human rights. What does it mean today in this globalized world, because we are not alone, we are in a globalized world. How do we re-implement a project based on that? And the second part is, how do we work? Because when we are speaking as humanists, I look to you, here you have a lot of young people, but I observe that in my organization, in Cal, in Belgium, a lot of people are old people. And I observe that globally in other parts of Europe that humanists, they are between themselves and they are going between themselves. And we don't take in account that we have new generation with new condition, with new demand. And how can we together think how to start to have a project, a new project with this kind of new situation, new way to communicate between us, new way to be in the world, but to be European at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this contribution. And now I would give the voice to our panelists. Please try not to speak more than 5 minutes each.
Thank you, Cara. I doubt I shall be 5 minutes. A couple of... First of all, Piotr's definition of Europe as being to do with being ideological and existentialist. Now I know why Britain's leaving, because you couldn't find anything less British than being existentialist and committed to ideology rather than practicality. That said, more serious points. Kaya was talking, others said already, that fascism is also a European invention. I'm not a good enough historian to know whether that's literally true, but certainly fascism has played its part in European history. But it's not a European value, it's a nationalist value, or it's a value of a movement. It's not shared. They may share tactics, but they don't share objectives. And so it can't serve as a unifying European value, I think. One thing that I do think is been mentioned, but I think it's worth underlining, is the rule of law. The idea that our rulers are subject to the law just as much as we are. And that is a sophisticated and advanced thought. It's not something that you find commonly arising. But it's that underlay, for example, in Britain, the Magna Carta, whose, what is it, how many centenaries is it we just passed? I can't remember. 800th centenary we celebrated a couple of years ago. And it was that underlay the Bill of Rights as well. This was a way of reinforcing to the king whom we had imported to get rid of our Catholic, James II. Yes, sorry, more like that, okay. To tell him what the rules were. But those rules were already established. It wasn't an invention then, it was something that had grown. Now, as to the future, because if I'm going to come in under 5 minutes, I need to get a move on. I see one thing that is extremely important for a future for Europe, and that is to build our unification, to build on our unified values, in particular through education. And education in a couple of directions in particular. One of them is the sort of moral education that humanists find very amenable, but the values that we would want to advance for a civic morality, as well as a personal one, those are values that are widely shared way beyond the non-religious humanist movement, and they are already finding a place in educational systems in many countries. The second bit of education, I think, is about history, and it's a reformed history teaching we need. Too often, history in the past has been taught in a thoroughly nationalistic way. But here is something that the European institutions can help forward, and indeed are beginning to do, providing history syllabuses or critiques of other history syllabuses that are based on a European view, a wider than the nationalist view of what has happened in the past, so that we can all learn from history, because learning from history, I think, is vital if we, as it's often been said, are to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. And that sort of thing is beginning to happen through some of the work of the Council of Europe and some of the work of the OSCE, which has been sponsoring the provision, the writing of history syllabuses for the former Yugoslavia, to try to reconcile some of the deep differences there. Okay, that's, I think, my 4 minutes, I don't know.
So first of all, we should probably not use the word identity any longer, because identity gives the impression that you are always identical. So I would suggest that rather than identical, we are not identical to what we used to be in the past. So when we talk about what Europe is, we shouldn't think of something that can be applied to what Europe is, was, and will always be. Rather, I would suggest to use the concept that an Italian historian that was half Italian, half French in a way, because he lived in a frontier area, people living in a frontier area, like Renan, like Federico Chabot, the one I'm talking now, and Sipar Valiket, myself, I'm coming from the frontier region too, are always a little bit more sensitive, probably, to this kind of, like those coming from totally different, from diverse backgrounds. I would suggest to use the phrase sense of individual, sense of historical individuality, because an individual changes throughout the ages, like social bodies do. And I would just like to tackle the problem of the dark side of Europe. Of course, when we say what this sense of historical individuality should be,
we are using and we are proposing a prescriptive, not a descriptive idea of what Europe is. That is what we think we should be, and what the legal principles that are in force today in all our nation states and at the European level prescribe it should be. We learned from our dark history. Europe is not a triumphal march throughout the centuries. It is because of the attempted suicide that we made 1 century ago, with its follows, with what follows 30 years later, the 2 world wars, that we decided that we would never have something like that again, and that we should come back to the best part of our historical heritage. Never again, ni wieder, jamais plus ça, nunca más, mai più, nikad više, I don't know, I know a little Croatian, I don't know Polish, but translated in whatever other language you want. That was the starting point of the European institutions, and that was the prescriptive idea that was built upon what best we had in our historical heritage. And from this point of view, even the best parts of the Western world, in my opinion, are what Fernand Braudel in the early 60s still could call, without being considered a visionary, the overseas extra-European Europes. And he included in this, of course, the United States, Australia, Canada, and so on. Because after all, it is true that there is a common heritage that links us to these parts of the world in terms of cherishing individual rights, the rule of law, and so on and so on. And we owe to the Americans, of course, the idea that the Constitution should be the parameter of legitimacy of ordinary laws. Nevertheless, they had a totally European culture when they drafted their institutions, when they wrote their constitution. And I admit here that there is a contradiction, but a positive one in my opinion, in thinking what the European sense of historical identity is, and the fact that this set of value has a universalistic vocation. It's not universal because despite some international charters, there are of course larger areas of the world where the situation is worsening, and we are not safe, of course, in our situation. But when we say what is, in our opinion, the identity of Europe, we use a prescriptive and not a descriptive idea of what we should be. And that's more or less, I think, a clarification of the reason why I think that we are entitled to say this, even though we must know that the reason why we are cherishing so much these principles is because we ourselves were the enemies, or many of our fellow citizens in the past were the enemies, and are again, in a large part of them, the enemies of what is best, of what is most peculiar of our historical identity. Thank you.
Which we are confronting here. Well, this is a big political battle, and there are lots of different issues involved. I mean, what I see in Europe, the one reason for the rise of the far right is the collapse of the left, basically in most of Europe. And I identify with the left politically, and just I think that a lot of the people who are voting for these parties are from the traditional left-wing constituency. There were people who 20, 30, 40 years ago were voting for a Labour Party, Socialist Party, and so on, and in different kind of social democratic parties. And a lot of them are now kind of lost, and they are now vulnerable, and they are being taken advantage of by the far right, because the liberal parties, the center right, and conservatives and so on are not, and the social democrats, whatever is left of the social democrats, socialists, and Labour Party and so on, are not really addressing the issues which are important for these people, and for a lot of them it is economic actually. But since there are no economic solutions being offered, even the left-wing parties have sort of surrendered to international capital, to international corporatism, and people are left at the mercy of market forces, they are now responsive to appeals based on nationalism, racism, and this sort of thing. And we've already seen that in the 1930s. I mean, the fascist parties, Nazi party, they picked up a lot of support from the people who used to vote for left-wing parties at that time. And so this is, I think, this is one reason for this whole problem. And I'm not sure what's the easy answer for that. But the left, the European left needs to have take a good look at itself, and to see how it's going to really address the real concerns of the working class people in most of Europe, because a lot of the working class people in Britain voted for Brexit, if I'm correct, even though I think it was not in their best interest, and for Le Pen, even though I think it was not in their, well, in terms of Brexit, I don't think it was in their best interest to see Britain leave the EU. I mean, there have been very practical consequences. I mean, there was, for example, a town or village in Wales which voted for Brexit, and then the next day they discovered that they are going to lose lots of the European Union funding, because the European Union had programs, or has programs in place to help a lot of the depressed areas, depressed regions in Europe, and it's helped a lot of people, but there has been a disconnect, and the people on the ground, the average people, working class people and so on, have for some reason disregarded that, and they see themselves in a difficult economic situation, and they have they're looking for scapegoats, and there are different scapegoats. There are immigrants, and then there is Brussels, the European Union, bureaucracy, and so on. So they have responded to all of these type of appeals. So this is one whole broad area that needs to be looked at. And this is a political issue, and it's a political issue, I think, for all sorts of left-oriented parties. The other thing that I see in Europe in terms of immigrants, which is, I mean, the whole migration issue is fueling the right-wing populism, is the failure of integration in Europe. I mean, I've lived a long time in the United States, and whatever problems are in the US has all sorts of serious problems, and as we know, gun violence and all sorts of crazy things going on there. But the United States has been far more successful in integrating people from different parts of the world. And Europe has failed quite spectacularly especially in some parts of Europe, especially in France, Belgium, maybe to some extent Britain. And it's a continuing issue. Of course, Europe is not really, European countries are not immigrant countries the way the United States is, so it may be unfair to compare the United States with France, which is a long-established national state, which was not founded on some ideas, but it's just a state based on the people who have lived there for centuries, and the same applies to all the other European states. So this is a challenge for Europe to try to become more like the United States in that sense. I certainly don't advocate Europe becoming like the United States in many other ways, but and one problem is that Europe has become more like that in terms of the rule of market forces and the collapse of the welfare state and so on. It's become more American in that sense. But in the sense of integration, I think Europe could do more to follow the American example. Maybe not only American, but Canadian, Australian, and so on, in terms of integrating people into European society. So I think there has to be a lot of focus on better integration and also economic integration, so that we don't have lots of marginalized immigrants who are unemployed and on the one hand, or they're seen as a threat to the other, people in Europe. So these are just some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Ja myślę, że zajmowanie się tożsamością w jakiś taki sposób planowania, budowania tej tożsamości naszej współczesnej chyba nie ma znaczenia, bo tożsamość po prostu cały czas się wydarza. Natomiast ważniejsze jest, i myślę, że to jest to, co my tutaj robimy w tych naszych stowarzyszeniach, czy to, co możemy robić w szkołach, na uniwersytetach, czyli ważniejsze jest, by z jednej strony pokazać właśnie te różne wartości, które były wytwarzane, negatywne również, żeby pokazać historię. No i dzięki oczywiście historii w takim szerokim sensie. Tutaj już był wspomniany ten czarny okres czy II wojny światowej, czy przede wszystkim dla mnie ważny jest ten okres kolonializmu, bo jednak świadomość tych relacji, które zachodziły pomiędzy poszczególnymi kulturami, poszczególnymi kontynentami, powinna być naszym udziałem, bo to też jest ten element, który pozwoli nam zrozumieć, kim jesteśmy, ale po co? Po co nam w ogóle tożsamość? No, to, co najważniejsze, to chyba budowanie relacji, bo teraz w świecie, który ma taki charakter coraz bardziej zintensyfikowanych relacji, nie tylko społecznych, ale właśnie wielokulturowych, w świecie multikulturalizmu, w świecie globalizacji, chyba najważniejsze jest budowanie właśnie relacji. I to powinniśmy robić świadomie, zarówno na poziomie politycznym, czyli takiej ogólnej, prawda, płaszczyzny, jak również w takim indywidualnym wymiarze. No bo polityka czy kultura nie wydarza się w jakimś się rejonie abstrakcyjnym, tylko to jesteśmy my, którzy idziemy do urny i głosujemy na jakieś partie, my, którzy jesteśmy w jakichś instytucjach i albo przyjmujemy, albo odmawiamy przyjęcia komuś, prawda, obywatelstwa czy wejścia do danego kraju, to jesteśmy my, którzy podejmujemy dyskurs z ludźmi, których spotykamy na ulicy. No więc w tym sensie bez przede wszystkim takiej strategii nie tyle powiedziałabym integracyjnej, co właśnie edukacyjnej na różnych płaszczyznach. Ta nasza, zarówno to bycie Europejczykiem, jak i nasza tożsamość się nie wydarzy. No ale myślę, patrząc właśnie na tradycję budowania różnych choćby stowarzyszeń i tego takiego działania od strony obywatelskiej, które w świecie, już powiedziałabym szerzej zachodnim, jest bardzo popularne i jest też takim elementem kształtującym Europę, myślę, że możemy dużo zrobić. Tak optymistycznie.
I would say that people would identify with what is working and what is pragmatic and what's good for them. It's not like we can, as you said, it's not that we can construct identity, a new identity. The people would identify when it suits them. For instance, I would like to say a few things about about those things other panelists said. For instance, I think there is both sides to every idea, every aspect of human life. For instance, when we take this gun violence in the United States, for instance, of course, most of these attacks of these problems with gun violence happen in schools when the attacker is sure that he will be the only one with the gun. That's a very interesting aspect of the situation. In other areas they are not so very often. And in the schools, because all the other people who will come to the school will be deprived of the guns. They can carry arms, just not in schools and in several other public places. So and okay, when the people have guns, then they can, for instance, avoid such massacres like in Bataclan in Paris. For instance, there was a presentation of the Muhammad caricatures in Garland in Texas, and there was no massacre because the attackers were immediately stopped by a first man with the gun. And we very often forget about that we can have different ideas than the Americans, but they are not necessarily bad because they are not European ideas. The same with the capital punishment. Of course, we can point out that sometimes they are very unwisely stated, but for people who murder a couple of people, we can ask ourselves what's the job of law, what's the purpose of law, if it's to punish or if it's to protect the population from the people who commit crimes. It's not an easy answer, and I think that's the main reason of those differences in legal system. Okay, but I think that I can also agree with the notion that the left is somehow sleeping or inactive in Europe. When we look at the European project, it has been developed mostly by the Christian Democrats and with some help from the Social Democrats.
The liberals.
Also, yes. When we look at the European Parliament, we also have liberals, and but they are the third party, and they are like, you know, Christian Democrats, then the Social Democrats, and just, you know, 200 mandates less the liberals. And okay, but so they are okay. The liberals are like the third party that sometimes decides which side would win, because they add this additional 70 or 80 votes for either side. I think that when we look at the Christian democratic view of economy, for instance, they are usually for this ordoliberalismus, the German invention, and ordoliberalismus is based on the notion that economy can wait for political instruction, and economy cannot really wait for political instruction. For instance, Mr. Schulz was very worried, and as he stated in one of his books, that, of course, he's a social democrat, but it's basically the same way of thinking about economy, that they would like to the stock markets in Europe to wait for some seconds as they can prepare the European populations for the major changes in economy. And he was so outraged that those bloody stock markets cannot wait this bloody 5 minutes or 5 seconds. But it's already outrageous for every people who know how economy works, that he would like them to wait those few seconds, because a whole lot of things could happen in this 5 or 6 seconds. And the reality, economic reality, is this: that Europe is unable to compete with the cheaper labor force and so on and so on. And it, for instance, when the World Trade Organization was created in the 1990, it became clear that those social benefits, for instance, the Sweden used to have, they couldn't be really continuous in full, because they were making already Sweden very not competitive enough to cope with the global market. So it's not that we wouldn't like those benefits to keep them, but it's just the economical reality of globalization that forces us to abandon some of them. And I think that in this field, it's not so much to be done. I think we will have to adapt to even more liberalization of I don't know, economy or something. And but what we can do is, I think that we should adapt some of these more pragmatic views on things. We shouldn't be, because already with one of the panelists, with David, we already discussed the thing that maybe, for instance, when we talk about the freedom of expression in Europe, that we are sometimes very worried that that some ideas would bring back the shadows of fascism and communism, and political fascism and communism didn't happen, for instance, in the United States, and they are less frightened when such ideas come, and we have this tendency of thinking that everything almost could be potentially fascist or communist or something. And I think what we need is more pragmatic look on the political problems. We shouldn't really call ourselves like, you know, fascist or communist leaning, but more think how many people from different cultures we can assimilate and so on. It's a more pragmatic view. I think that would be very wise to do. Yeah. Thank you.
Our time is up. I will allow only David to take 2 more minutes because he was the one to speak the least of all.
You are full of surprises. Okay. I think I'm not going to react to what the others said, but just add an extra note. It does seem to me that the European Union has a great opportunity if only it can get its act together. And perhaps the shock of Brexit will enable the 27 to make a new start. And this relates, in fact, to the idea that globalization and economic liberalism are unstoppable. I'm not sure, well, it is plainly true that no individual state can stand against the forces of rampant, uncontrolled capitalism. They would get punished too rapidly. But I think that the EU as a whole represents a large enough section of the market that if they do stand united and introduce creeping controls over capitalism, if they innovate with things like a Tobin tax, a financial transaction tax, with a basic income and moves like that, they could build up an alternative economic model to that of the capitalist globalization model that we have at the moment. And I think that sort of thing is something that is somewhat on the fringe as far as humanism is concerned, but nevertheless completely consonant and compatible with it. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.